few years ago, a friend gave me some broken Sennheiser headphones. Now, headphones are usually pretty basic, so there's not a lot that can go wrong apart from a break in the headphone cable, which was indeed the problem here and can usually be easily fixed by replacing said cable. But not so much in the case of these ones. As you can see, I removed the cable and threw it out a long time ago, but just take a look at the rubber thing that the cable used to come out of. It's tiny. It's hard to get a sense of the scale, or lack thereof, on video, but it's less than 2 millimeters in diameter, and has to carry 3 signals, both stereo channels and ground. Honestly, in my opinion, this is a design flaw. It's hardly surprising that wires probably the width of a human hair are gonna break under heavy usage. Now, at first I actually bodged a replacement cable by shaving down a regular size cable I had lying around. But unsurprisingly, it didn't last very long. The stress of said shaving probably ruined the cable before it was even soldered in. I removed that cable, planning to recable again with a wire that did fit, but I had a lot of trouble finding one. If you search thin 3.5mm cable, the results are unconvincing. None of them say what diameter they are, so buying one is definitely a gamble. I might have been able to make my own cable out of, I don't know, heat shrink and wires, but who knows how well that would have turned out. So I put it on the shelf and decided to come back to it later. Now, many years later, I have a new idea that's a little more radical, but I think will work just as well, if not better. It started with wondering if I could make this rubber hole bigger for a thicker cable, and then jumped to, what if I make it really big and put a socket in there? That's some like premium headphone shit, and there's no real reason it shouldn't be possible with just a handful of inexpensive parts. So let's give it a shot, and while we're here, I'm also going to replace these ear pads because, just look. These things are literally disintegrating, and they leave a trail of these fake leather flakes everywhere they go. Also, they smell like my friend's hair. Not that I've smelled my friend's hair much. So yeah, this will be a repair, restoration, and modding of these headphones. Let's get started. Opening these headphones isn't hard, but can be a little cryptic the first time. There are no screws anywhere, no obvious ways of taking it apart. Uh-oh, we in for another set of plastic tabs? Thankfully no, the ear pads are just clipped in with these little pegs and you can pretty much just pop them out. They can be a little tough the first time, you might need to use a flathead screwdriver to persuade them, but otherwise it's pretty straightforward. But then you come across this big slab of foam and once again it'll seem like a dead end. But since I've opened these before, you actually can see how this works. There are 4 Phillips screws usually hidden underneath the foam and you basically have to stab blindly through it to take them out. I don't know about you, but I always feel weird about having to permanently damage things to open them. Not that it really matters here since it's all hidden behind ear pads anyway, but you know. I almost wonder if it's a warranty thing like those old Xbox stickers. Anyways, you open it up and fairly typically for headphones and speakers, the internals are pretty basic. All the magic is in the actual speaker units themselves and there are no other electronics to speak of apart from this tiny little board, and I don't think it really counts. It doesn't do anything, there isn't a single component on it, it's just 3 direct connections from one side of the board to the other. I'm not even sure why it's here. I guess it probably makes manufacturing and repair a lot easier since it's easier to wire to a board than to more wires. Anyways, the now loose speaker is hardwired in, meaning it will almost certainly tug and strain its connection while we're working on it, which is not ideal. I could desolder it, but I decided to just tape it down. Because I care. Alright, well let's go ahead and see how a new socket would fit. Obviously this phallic rubber insert is too small. Story of my life, but I discovered last time that I opened this that it's actually pretty easy to remove. If you shove it in hard enough, it'll just pop out, leaving a much bigger gap that I think is big enough for a socket. I had the standard wiring plug lying around, which I think will work and basically means it's free, right? Okay, cool. The gap is big enough for the narrow part to fit through, but small enough that the main part still sticks out. I'll obviously need to use some epoxy or something to hold it in place, and it might not be the prettiest thing up close. It's a little long and kind of like sticking a circle into a square, but I don't think it'll be that bad, and it does look like it'll work. Well, first the wiring. Pretty simple stuff, just left, right, and ground. I'm using thin Kynar wire because, firstly, it's still probably thicker than the original wires, but secondly, while it looks like there's a lot of empty space, most of it gets taken up once the headphones are back together. I'm already pushing my luck a little with the socket, so I want the cables to be as space efficient as possible. The only problem is I only have one color on hand and have 3 different signals to wire up. So I color-coded them myself with a Sharpie. At least now I'll know which one's which. I soldered the wires to the plug and soldered the plug to the board, and very soon it was already time to test. No, this is not the finished result, but if I'm using something as relatively permanent as epoxy, I want to leave that till last when I already know everything else is working. And it's a good thing I did that because I immediately discovered something was wrong. Using this stereo test from YouTube, I found that the left speaker was playing both some left and some right, and the right speaker was playing nothing. Huh. I mean, it's always possible I made a mistake, but it's only 3 wires. There's not much room for error. Especially the crossover from right to left. I mean, it's one thing if a wire just isn't soldered right, but how the hell are they seeping into each other? I reflowed everything as best as I could, but no change. As far as I can tell, there's nothing wrong with my wiring. I did some probing with the multimeter, which was inconclusive. Analog audio can be all kind of interconnected anyway, so it was hard to tell what was or wasn't connected properly. I decided to disassemble the other headphone, just to see if there could possibly be something wrong with the headphones themselves, but I couldn't find anything. In an attempt to narrow down the root cause of the problem, I ended up removing my socket and soldering in a known good cable. Lo and behold, it worked perfectly. So if the headphones are fine, and assuming my wiring was fine, the only culprit left is the socket itself. I don't know how that could have happened. Was it broken from the factory, or did it break in the several years I had it? I guess we'll never know, but I went ahead and ordered some replacements. This might actually be a blessing in disguise, because I think these can end up looking a lot better. I wired this socket up too, and this time it worked flawlessly. Left was coming out of left, right was coming out of right, no crossover between them, and everything sounded great. Well, as great as this song can sound. But finally, what should have been a very simple soldering job was working as it was supposed to. Now though came the real challenge, actually bonding the new socket with the headphone casing so it stays in place. At first I wondered if we had a neat mechanical solution here because these new sockets can be screw mounted. Maybe they could just be bolted into the plastic? But no, even with the included nut, the gap is just a little too big, so that wouldn't do. It was back to plan A, some kind of epoxy. Epoxies always make me really nervous because it's a lot harder to undo than, say, soldering. In many ways, you only get one shot at getting it right, and the results are fairly permanent. Of course, that's great if we don't screw it up because that means the socket should withstand some wear and tear. But yeah, getting the positioning right is key. The last thing we want is to have it permanently glued in just to discover it doesn't close properly anymore. Thankfully, I did a test fit while it was all closed up, and there is just enough space for the socket to fit in all the way. And this is also our first preview of what the finished result will look like. I think it's going to look pretty good. At this point, I taped the socket down. My hope is that way it'll all stay in place as I take it back apart and get started with the glue. I'm using a 2-part epoxy designed for ABS plastic, which is what the headphones are made of, and I believe the socket is too. After mixing the 2 parts together, a chemical reaction starts that gradually sets and cures the glue over the course of about 24 hours, after which it should all be stuck together and good to go. This stuff smells like balls though, for real. At least these headphones are for ears and not for noses. Using a toothpick, I carefully dabbed it between the socket and the casing. I wanted to use as much as I could to provide as much structural integrity as possible, but without so much that it would start leaking out through the gaps around the socket because I didn't think that would look very good. Alright, well I won't lie, it does look pretty messy. You wouldn't be surprised if you heard this was a 6-year-old's arts and crafts project, but it should be perfectly functional. Hopefully Gordon Ramsay would say,
"Looks a mess, yet it tastes delicious."
Except you shouldn't be eating it either, Gordon. 24 mildly nerve-wracking hours later, it was time to check how it ended up. The glue had set and was looking nice and sturdy. Just have to make sure it still fits together. Alright, looking good. It's definitely a close fit, we basically just got away with that. But hey, I actually think the end result looks pretty damn cool. I'm glad we ended up with this new socket, and I'm especially glad the casing happened to fit a socket with virtually no modifications. When you look at the mod closely, there are of course gaps, and there is a tiny blob of epoxy kind of poking through, but honestly it's not a big deal. From most angles you never see it, and overall it looks pretty good in my opinion. Plus the epoxy does seem to withstand plugging and unplugging. I guess we'll see if it holds up over time, but right now it seems pretty solid. All that's left to do is reassemble it and attach some new ear pads. These are still readily purchasable online and should greatly improve the experience. Since they were brand new parts, clipping them in was pretty tough. I ended up using a flathead screwdriver to tuck it under each little peg, and had to be really careful not to nick the ear pads before I could even use them for the first time. But it all worked out, and there we have it. Repaired, restored, and modded Sennheiser headphones. Despite some hurdles and imperfections, I consider this a huge success. I'd even consider doing this on headphones that aren't broken because it's kind of nice to get to choose your headphone cable. I can have a coiled or non-coiled cable if I want, a 1/4" or XLR plug on the other end without needing an extra adapter, a long cable for recording on a microphone stand, or a short cable for just sitting at my computer, and I can switch between any of them whenever I want. Hell, you could even use a Bluetooth kit and make it wireless. I wouldn't because I don't like Bluetooth audio, but I'm just saying there's no reason you couldn't. So I'm really happy with how this turned out, and I hope you found it as cool as I did. As always, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you all in the next video. Bye guys.
Subscribe to Mac KC.